I don't know why they decided to put it on the phone.
Great. Well, I think we're going to get rolling here. I expect more folks will join us as we get going underway. I've opened things up so folks can, if you have a webcam, please feel free to turn it on for the time being, and you can wave hello. We can see all the faces of folks who are here. Hi, John. Good to see John. Oh, nice to see all sorts of faces. And I'll pass things over to Sarah now to kick things off.
Hi, folks. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and to welcome you. So this webinar, just to make sure, it's like in a university, make sure you're in the right class. 30 years in 60 minutes, the story of Quebec's social economy. And my webcam, I think, is finally working. There's my face. Hi, everybody. So my name's Sarah Leeson-Clem. A lot of you might know me, and if you don't, I'm the Regional Director for CCEDNet in Manitoba. So I work with our Manitoba members on a range of programs and activities. And so you're already doing this, but if you haven't, more volume, please. I'll try and do this, and hopefully that'll help. If you haven't already, list your name and where you're from in the chat box. So the chat box is a great way to share your thoughts as we go and a chance to introduce yourself. So just to give a few introductory notes, I'm going to play moderator today. So the session is brought to you, as you might know, by the Canadian Community Economic Development Network. And if you didn't know, we are happy 20 years old this year. So we're celebrating our 20th anniversary, which is a pretty remarkable feat in the landscape that we all work in to sustain a network like this over time. We're a national network of several hundred community organizations and individuals working to create local economic opportunities that support inclusive and sustainable economies across Canada. We've done a bunch of webinars like this, and they are all available on our website free for members. So before we get going any further, something that we do here in Winnipeg that's considered very, very important to do is to remember where we are and the place that we're in. So I just want to acknowledge that for me, I'm in Winnipeg. I'm in Treaty 1 territory, understood to be the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We're not all here, of course, but we're all, if we're in Canada, we're here in Indigenous spaces and lands. And so it's a good way to get started, especially when we're meeting virtually, to remember where we are and what that means for us. And so to move forward, I want to thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to moderate today and excited about the conversation that we'll have, and want to welcome our speaker, Nancy Meanton. She's going to take us on a very quick tour of the past 30 years So you can imagine it's quite a feat to do that in an hour. And in that 30 years, the social economy has emerged to become a real major force in the socio-economic development of Quebec at the local, regional, and national level. We appreciate all of you being here, your support and participation. You're helping us honor the history of our network and helping us draw from that history to go forward. We need to be grounded in the histories of our movement and honoring sort of our elders. I think Nancy probably might not like to be considered an elder, I would guess, but she certainly is someone who's given incredible vision and care to this work over her whole career. And we need to honor that history and the knowledge that folks that have gone before us have. There's a social entrepreneur, Marc Langlois, who said, we must value history, not to have it stagnate progress, rather to inform the present and future. When history and hope dance in stride, it's a beautiful thing. I agree. A couple of technical notes if anyone's having trouble. You're probably listening to your computer speakers or headset. How well your computer is able to follow the audio and the presentations largely depends on the speed and quality of your internet connection. So if anything's being a bit choppy or delayed, it might help to close other applications that are connected to the internet, like Skype, Messenger, different Messenger apps, email software, or even just any browsers you've opened. Alternatively, you can also connect by phone. I think some of you may have done that. To do so, click through the phone icon at the top of your screen to find the phone connection details. And everyone should feel free to ask questions and contribute reflections in the chat box at the bottom right. So you've been adding your names and where you're from, which is great. You can also put questions there. We're going to gather those and highlight them during the open discussion at the end. And also, as it is an anniversary of CCEDNet, we've been celebrating our movement in a number of ways, and one is to collect toasts and tributes throughout the year that we're going to gather up and have to help us remember the incredible breadth of experience and people we have in our network. So if you have a memory or a toast or a shout out that you want to make, you can also feel welcome to include that in the chat box. We're also recording today's session, so it'll be posted on our website as a resource for others who couldn't be here today. So, go ahead and share that information with your colleagues and your own network. So, on to the main event. I'm very pleased to welcome you. Very pleased to have Nancy Meanton, who is currently the strategic advisor for the Chantier and sociale, the former CEO of the Chantier. So Chantier, for anyone who doesn't know it, you're going to know lots about it soon, but it's a very important collaborative organization in Quebec that's been one of the real motivators and instigators of social economy movement in that province. And Nancy sat as the CEO of that organization for much of its history and has been active also in the field of social innovation. With over 30 years of experience in the field of the social economy, social finance, and community economic development, she's recognized nationally and internationally and is a recipient of 2 honorary doctorates as well as the Order of Canada and the Order of Quebec. I'm also very pleased to say that Nancy is someone who's influenced my thinking on this work and our network locally in Manitoba, and is actually coming to visit us next month to help us do a little bit of looking at our network in Manitoba. So I'm so happy to join her today, and I'll turn it over to her. Nancy, off to you.
Hi, everybody. This is quite a challenge for me. Just to explain a little bit the context of this is that this is part of a contract that, in collaboration with CCEDNet and TS, based on how can we, that came from the McConnell Foundation, on how can we transfer some of the lessons learned across Canada based on the building of the Quebec movement over the past 30 years. And so the first thing I did was sit down and sort of write it out, and there's enough material. I have material for a book. If I get it published, I don't know. But just to be clear that today is, I guess, sort of like a speed dating in the sense of, trying to resume who you are and what you are and what you've worked on in a very, very short period of time. So I'll do the best I can, and as I say, it's just a teaser in the sense that I think every slide and every lesson that I'm going to put forward, I could spend a whole hour on. So I'm just going to rush through this, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end for questions. But as Sarah mentioned, I will be going to Winnipeg. I'll be going to Vancouver. I mean, these are the kinds of things that, and issues and discussions, some of which will be relevant to your particular context, and some of which are issues that have either nothing to do with your context or they're problems and solutions and things that you've already found solutions. But anyhow, I'll do the best I can, so here I go. So the presentation, I'll do an introduction about where are we at today, and what I did in terms of understanding the history is gone through certain periods, and I've divided into 5 periods. So just to sort of look at what did we achieve during that period, and what were the lessons that we learned, because a lot of them are still pertinent today, and then finishing very quickly on what are the future challenges. So if we go into the context of Quebec today, as Sarah mentioned, we do have a vibrant social economy ecosystem that continues to grow. I guess it'd be best to reflect on the fact that in 2013 there was framework legislation that was voted unanimously at the Quebec National Assembly to recognize the social economy as an integral part of the Quebec economy, which has all kinds of implications in terms of new policies and so on. Again, we'll spend an hour just on that. We have a network in Quebec of national, regional, and sectoral organizations that comprise a very rich ecosystem. We have financial tools that are adapted to collective enterprises and organizations. We have strong relationships with universities for research and knowledge transfer. We have organizations dedicated to labor force development, to social purchasing, to mutualized purchasing, to knowledge transfer. We have ongoing strategic collaborations with municipalities, labor unions, environmental groups, the private sector, particularly around social purchasing. We've been playing a pivotal role in international networking and collaboration for many years with the OECD, with the United Nations Task Force, and particularly with the Global Social Economy Forum, which is based on the notion of cities and the social and solidarity economy. And what for me as an old lady is very encouraging is this strong involvement of youth, including student associations, youth networks, and rapidly growing number of young collective entrepreneurs. The involvement, for example, of student associations in this kind of movement is, as you all can imagine, how encouraging that is. How did it start? When people try and understand the social economy movement in Quebec, it's important to understand it's renewal, because we have an old co-op movement, and but I wasn't around for that, so I'm talking about what I know. Is that was in the early 80s, and there was a context of unemployment, social exclusion. It was the beginning of what we call today neoliberal economics. The trickle-down effect with Reagan and Thatcher and Mulroney, and economic development. And it's still the dominant practice today, is to say minimize government intervention. Market forces in the private sector will be have the path to prosperity, and that the wealth and so on would trickle down to our communities. We realized that that wasn't happening, and so we decided to take on another approach. And I'm talking about the community sector in Point St. Charles. So there was the creation of the first Community Economic Development Corporation in 1984, but we weren't alone, and that's important to understand that there was the labor movement that created at exactly the same time the Quebec Solidarity Fund. So that was a new way for the labor movement as a social movement to get involved in the issue of the economy. We created our first investment fund with the Fonds Solidarité in the Southwest for our neighborhood. But we also, and there was a big mobilization at the end of that period of all of Quebec with 1,500 people from all sectors and regions that came together to seek solutions to high unemployment. But we also started right away to work on an international level, understanding that we would never change the dynamics just on our own. And so we convened with our colleagues from France a major international conference in 1988, which is a story in of itself. And CCEDNet, I don't think CCEDNet didn't exist at the time, but some of the founders of CCEDNet were involved with us in this. And it allowed us to start having some public policy and some recognition for the pertinence, despite the fact that we were in the heart of the trickle-down neoliberal period. And this all led to the creation of the first, what we call the multi-party territorial committees to stimulate the economy and job creation on a territorial basis. So really the recognition of the pertinence of community economic development. What did we learn and what were the issues and the lessons we learned? The first one was the importance of identifying ourselves as an economic actor. And once again, that was not an easy debate. Community sector, the social sector saying, we are not just there to resolve social problems, but we consider that we are part of the economy and we should be identified as an actor within the economy. to do that, we had to reappropriate the very concept of the economy as a social science, not as some kind of a thing that you just gave off to experts and they put, crunch the numbers but that there were choices being made constantly around the economy, and some of them were wrong choices if we took it from the perspective of the common good. We had debates around, should our way forward be to create smaller utopias where we would create this perfect enterprise where everybody had the same salary, where, some kind of, so we sort of the whole debate between this alternative economy that, is really on the side, or digging into, with all its contradictions, on transforming the entire economy. We were being thrown, the government was throwing out ideas of, okay, the solution is entrepreneurship. Everybody's going to create enterprises. When you're working in a community where, 30% of the people are functionally illiterate and so on, I mean, this is just not the way forward. There were issues of gentrification, so we realized and learned very quickly you had to build a multi-dimensional approach. But it creates all kinds of questions on how do you introduce citizens' voices in the field of economic development, and particularly how do you work with the private sector, being from the social sector? Should we be collaborating with what was perceived by many of us as the enemy? So, and out of that came this really understanding that if we really wanted to do some economic development for the benefit of our community, it took a bottom-up approach that recognized our own skills and our expertise and made us part of the equation as opposed to passively asking for others to get the job done. So that was the first period. So it was really a coming, sort of a starting to identify ourselves within the economy. The next period, from 89 to 96, was a very tough period in Quebec. The unemployment rate was extremely high, 13% in 1993. High welfare, real estate collapse in Montreal, tensions between urban centers and rural zones, and CED was starting to emerge, but it was really just a pilot project, and far from, we're still not mainstream, but we certainly have more recognition than we did at the time. And so where a lot of the innovation was going on was in few communities that had this opportunity, including the one in which I was involved in the southwest of Montreal. And that was where we started to create these structures that were formal structures recognized by government, but were brought together, community, private, and labor representatives, and eventually over the years added cultural sector and so on, but to really take on a community economic development approach. And that was mainly in urban areas, but at the same time in rural communities there was also coming together of social movements and so on around the need to revitalize our rural communities, and links were created between the two. In that period, what we learned was how important this need for open spaces for social innovation were, in a very practical way, were sources of inspiration. And when I talk about spaces for social innovation, talking about bringing together places where you have people from different sectors, from the private sector, from the union, coming together with all their concerns, their points of view, and their expertise, and that was really very, very magic periods for innovation. But to do that, it has to be well-rooted in communities, and it has to empower communities. This idea of having some experts in social innovation, we didn't even call it at the time. Innovation for us, right from the beginning, was there were tough problems, and none of the experts had solutions, so we had to figure them out ourselves. So the importance of community roots and community empowerment became really clear and brought results. When I say it became clear, it wasn't an ideological thing. It was bringing results. We also began to realize that entrepreneurship, creating enterprises that we didn't want to just fit. That was part of the issue. If you had devitalized zones or rural zones, and then you had to wait for some private entrepreneur to come and sort of choose your community and try and attract them, and to say, well, maybe the community can be involved in being, setting up enterprises and being part of those processes, and so that was a very important, step forward. First you define yourself as an economic actor, then you can start to define yourself as an entrepreneur, as people who can set up and run businesses, and that always creates these tensions between economic and social imperatives. But for us, these were very creative tensions, and it forced us to really rethink, and forced everybody to rethink the way we were doing things. We were inspired, and once again, this whole idea of thinking globally, acting locally, that we maintained, and constantly we're looking at what was going on internationally. to be able to be inspired. And so many of our innovations were often ideas that were, sort of inspired and then applied in our own context. And that was where, we hadn't started to talk about the social economy at the time, but we began to realize that if the community wanted to become an entrepreneur, then we could set up these enterprises, and even we didn't even have at first we didn't have the vocabulary. We actually called them enterprises that were economically viable and socially profitable. And then finally, a few years later, we got the vocabulary of social economy, which was very helpful. And once again, the other issue was moving from an idea of supporting individual entrepreneurs through the whole, and to say that the best way for this to really have a long-term impact on our community was through collective ownership. So that's where, that's why it's important to understand this period, because when we hit the next period, which was one specific time and an opportunity, that was absolutely, that we were able to seize and maximize its impact, and we still have repercussions until today, was because we had all those debates and we had that whole process of learning by doing in communities, in rural and urban communities across Quebec, and dialogues going on with the private sector, with the labor movement, with different community movement, and so on. So in 1996, this was sort of a very major and complicated time in Quebec, post-referendum, where, as people remember, that had sharply divided Quebec society. 40,000, don't forget, 40,000 votes separated the yes and the no. So we were coming out of that. There was a high unemployment. There was devitalization of rural regions. There was a weak Montreal economy. And there was pressure from international agencies, as they do, to cut back on government deficit. And so that was the choice that the government made, to say, well, we're going to go towards a zero deficit. So in that context, and this is part of Quebec culture, the government convened a summit on the economy and employment. And what was different on this one, well, first of all, it's just the whole idea of you bring together all the major actors of Quebec society, of heads of Bombardier, of the Royal Bank, of National Bank, of Desjardins, but also heads of labor, of church, of cities, of cultural organizations, and social actors, community-based actors were there for the first time. And we were convened in sort of to be told, look, the government has no more money, they're not the ones going to create employment. We're going to organize a summit, and we're going to ask the private sector to, come and they created these working groups. And one of the working groups was on this thing called the social economy that nobody really quite understood, and that's how I got involved in presiding this committee. But here we had this opportunity really to show what we could do. How, by responding to community needs, by responding in through collective action, we could create employment and take up challenges of the society. So what we did was we got all kinds of people working in daycare and forestry and whatever, in rural and urban revitalization, and said, hey, this is our chance. What can we put forward? And we put forward a whole series of proposals that were very, very constructive, and we were able to compare those to what the traditional private sector was putting forward, and to see that a government could see, everybody could see how this made sense. Out of that summit, the daycare policy in Quebec, the $5 a day daycare policy, was inspired by one of the networks that was part of our work, which is a nonprofit daycare centers that put forward this idea of having this type of policy, and government response at the summit by saying, okay. We also were able to convince the private sector and partners to put a special tax to create a fund to fight poverty. There was the idea of a local development policy to support the development of SMEs in communities across Quebec. But what we said to people was, okay, but those SMEs don't have to be just traditional businesses. They can also be social economy enterprises, co-ops, enterprising nonprofits. And therefore, if you're putting together a system to support economic development at a local level, the social economy has to be part of that policy. We talked about the importance of recognizing the need for labor force development, and we were able to win the creation of a labor force partnership commission. We talked about the importance of access to capital. We didn't start last year, and it didn't start in downtown Toronto. It started where we were talking about the need to, and we were actually able to leverage $5 million of private donations and $5 million from the Quebec government to create the first fund that was dedicated exclusively to nonprofit and cooperative enterprises and so on. So all this to say is that the summit was a very important moment for us, but what really made the difference was the fact that everybody accepted to work together independently of, their structure, be it co-op or nonprofit, be they CED, territorial-based or sectorial-based. Everybody decided to work with a common identity, which we call the social economy. That was the vocabulary they gave us, and so we took it and said, okay, that's what we are. We're a social economy. And that made a huge difference because it showed the mass, the critical mass that we already occupied within the Quebec economy and within Quebec society, and how important it was by coming together to get the kind of recognition that we needed. And the other thing that we were able to show because of the creativity and the way we were able to make these proposals is that asking for the government to create policy and then us sort of receiving it was not the way forward, and the huge potential that we were able to demonstrate through this whole process of co-construction. So these are words that come back to us in 2017, 18, and 19, but these are things that we were talking about at the time. So out of that, the summit was really a trampoline for us to rise and move forward into the next period from 1996 to 2004, where we really concentrated in a very practical way on collective action at the heart of the economy, of placing the whole notion of social economy as collective enterprise within the economy. The context, of course, was a context of, where the whole impacts of global warming, of climate change, of globalization were leading to lots of social movements, best illustrated by the World Social Forum that grew in at that time. But in Quebec, there was even a collective which they finally did, was to win a law on the elimination of poverty. It doesn't mean that we've eliminated poverty. It just means that there was a whole, to give you the idea of the kind of mobilization where people were taking a look at the negative impacts of this trickle-down effect, and there was a global mobilization around it. At the same time, we had a government that was also, despite cutbacks and so on, did come up with a whole bunch of progressive social policies, the $5 daycare, the local development I mentioned, wage parity for women, support for the community sector, anti-poverty legislation, the freeze on tuition fees. So it was a moment where social movements were strong, were very proactive, and the government was listening. And so in terms of accomplishments, for the social economy, there were a lot, but there was the creation this working group became a permanent organization called the Chantier sociale in 1999 of a multi-partite national organization, which is now, to make a connection, recognized by the government in the framework legislation as a privileged interlocutor of government on the issue of the social economy. There was the deployment of these local development centers and regional development councils that were based on territory, but once again, where the social economy and the support and the development of the social economy was an integral part of their mandate. There was a creation of a network of local investment funds that were modeled on the investment fund that we had created in the Southwest in the 80s. There was opening up by the government of access to loans and loan guarantees from their investment branch. We were able to create the first community university research alliance and mobilize a lot of researchers and universities around very pertinent research on the social economy, and that really helped us in terms of credibility, in terms of getting public policy on the table. And we fought the good fight of getting, and we actually won in 2001, though didn't have any specific consequences for several years, of getting social innovation recognized within the scientific policy of Quebec as early as 2001. But at the same time, it was an intense period of questions as debate, which is normal because the social economy was, moving out of the margins. It had been seen by many as just an economy for the poor, that we would sort of pick up the pieces of that. The dominant system was a mess they were making, and sort of, run behind them and pick up the mess, which was poverty and pollution and so on. And and as we started to say, no, that's not. We're an integral part of the economy, and we have to bring another logic into it. It created all kinds of debates. Some of them were debates within our sector, within our partners. For example, the whole issue of where do public services stop start, where do they stop, and where does social economy come in? There was a big debate around, you know, home care for the elderly, should that be within the public service or not? And there were, so those kinds of issues. There was a concern in the community sector. Are you asking us to commercialize community action? Are we all going to have to become, you know, entrepreneurs? What happened to, you know, the voluntary sector, the nonprofit sector, and so on, and the need for government and support for it? From the private sector, on the other hand, we got this idea of, oh, but this is unfair competition because supposedly, you know, you're going to get government support and we don't. Again, that's a whole, we could spend a whole hour on that one, but we were able to prove in case by case that the unfair competition came from the private sector because they had access to more government funding than we did. But anyhow, that's a whole other one. Huge discussion with the traditional cooperative structures that felt very uncomfortable being part of the social economy and very, very concerned that you know, nonprofits would be becoming enterprising nonprofits, and what was the specific role of cooperatives and the specific identity of cooperatives. And that's a debate that's still going on, but it was a very difficult debate. As I say, the economy for the poor, a component of the real economy, that was certainly an issue. The role of culture, you know, cultures being mainly nonprofit organizations, how does social economy and culture come together? The whole issue of international networking, there were all these debates were going on, not just at a Quebec level, but internationally. So these, I put that in because these are all debates. Some of them are still ongoing, and that were really important, and I'll come back to that in terms of the lessons. So what are the lessons we learned from this period? Well, the first was the need for a multidimensional approach to the social economy. That is, we understood, and we were always there right from the beginning, that the social economy is a tool in the fight against poverty, but it is not just a tool to fight poverty. It is another economic logic. And so we have to embrace our role in the fight against poverty, but not limit ourselves to that. And how do you articulate that? That was very important. The central role of social movements. It's clear that the social economy would never have gotten where it got to in Quebec. We hadn't had a very strong alliance with the labor movement, with the community sector, with the environmental movement, with the cultural democracy movement, cultural actors, and so on. And for those who don't know, the Chantier, you know, the social movements are an integral part of our governance structure. They're not just people we talk to every once in a while. They've always been part of that ongoing process. And doesn't mean that it doesn't create debate, but it means that it's a very important part of the way we move forward. The strategic importance of alliances with universities and research networks was once again an extremely important thing that we learned, that it gave us the credibility often in working both internationally and with our government to be able to have validation from the experts, even though in the field of social innovation, social economy, as we all know, the expertise is really on the ground. But the role of universities and research networks to systematize that, to make international comparisons, and gave us a huge legitimacy. And the last one, again, I think is really, really important, is that it was a period of intense debate. It was never easy going. You know, every corner we turned and every new field we went into, it raised a debate somewhere. We were disturbing something or old ways of doing, and that's part of what innovation is all about. But we put them on the table. And I think that that's the really important thing, is avoiding debates. You don't move forward, you spin. And we put the debates on the table, and, you know, sometimes we solved them and they came up again because things had changed. We had to re-debate them. And the best example is the labor movement, where we were seen for many years, you know, by some public sector unions as being like the Trojan horse just about, of the privatization of public services. And then, you know, like 10 years later, we have to innovate and we have to try new models, and it's the social economy that's going to help us. So, you know, there's the debates advanced, but they were difficult debates, and we had to have them, and we did. And I think that's a really important lesson, because they're never going to stop. The last period, how are we at the time? Oh, not too bad. The context, it was a more difficult context objectively, because there were elections of federal and provincial governments that were not favorable to the social economy necessarily. We had the 2008 financial crisis, but at the same time, you know, as I say, increasing awareness of the negative impacts of globalization, financialization of the economy, emergence of the Occupy movement, but at the same time, the rise of extreme right in Western democracy. So it was, you know, it's a bit of the reality still today. nevertheless, we were able to get a lot of things done in that period, despite that. And well, one was the very brief federal initiative that people probably know about.
All right, folks, it seems like we lost Nancy's audio here. Let me see if I can try to get her back on here. In the meantime, if you do have questions, feel free to type them into the chat box. We'll get Nancy on those.
Sheila or Shyla? Shyla.
It's tsunami of typing.
Sorry about that, folks. Again, just spoke with Nancy, and she's calling back in here. She lost her phone connection, so she'll be back in right away. And I see a question here about the PowerPoint presentation. Yes, we can share that out after the call, and we'll also share the recording of this call. You can fast forward through this interruption when you're watching the recording. Great, thanks, Jonathan.
Hello, sorry about that. Can you hear me? I don't know what happened.
Yes, that's great.
Okay.
And so we lost you just right at the beginning of the current slide.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so the $132 million federal investment, I don't know if people know about that, but that was a very specific opportunity with Paul Martin, who was very supportive of what was going on in Quebec and who we knew. So I won't go into that in detail, but in terms of what we were able to establish in Quebec, one of the main reasons, and this is really what for me was very significant, was 10 years after the 1996 summit, which is really where we sort of were born, but we were sort of a small group, and visitors at the summit of the important actors. We realized that we were probably strong enough to organize our own summit, which we did, and we did it on the basis of delegates, and we prepared over a year with working groups and so on, and regions and sectors, and that was for me in 2006 where we could really say we had a movement, and it took up such importance that even when we hadn't invited the Premier of Quebec, he decided he wanted to come, and that was where we were able to get a lot of traction in terms of the first government plan for collective entrepreneurship. That came as a direct result of that summit in 2007. But at the same time, to understand that the Chantier was a national a Quebec-wide organization of, that brought together all kinds of different actors and networks. But we also supported the creation of regional hubs called our regional poles of the social economy, and we signed agreements so that we had partners in all the regions of Quebec to work with us, not not in a hierarchical way, but in a collaborative way and that created a real movement across Quebec. It meant we also were able to sign a partnership agreement with the City of Montreal and other partners around the development of the social economy in Montreal. Out of the federal initiative, we created a patient capital fund, which everybody thought we were crazy to even talk about the notion of patient capital. And now I listen to the radio, former heads of the Caisse de dépôt, and I was at a thing for artificial intelligence. Everybody's talking about patient capital, but at the time nobody was. We were crazy people, and we did it. We started to work on public purchasing with a campaign called Social Economy I Buy, and that was initiated by the Quebec government in their action plan in 2007. We created a shared platform to be able to buy and negotiate better prices called Commerce Solidaire. And there was a creation of a new organization for knowledge transfer and social innovation, which brought together universities and practitioners on terms of to accelerate the learning curve on how we can learn from each other. And what we were able to win in the context of we put it forward during an election period, and the government who was elected had committed to it. So that's when we won the framework legislation on the social economy. Okay, after that, before I go into the lessons, at the end of that period, we had a hard reality check, because there was the government that took power, even though it was new leadership within and their position was they didn't want to see civil society involved in any way at all in economic and local development. That was the job for those who were elected once every 4 years, and that was it. So there was an end to institutionalized citizen participation in different structures of what we call concertation. But despite that, because of the strength of the movement, we were able to convince the government to continue to support and recognize regional social economy, the Chantier, because we had our framework legislation, but also regional social economy hubs is one of the only government-supported regional bodies with civil society participation that survived. And luckily, now that things have changed, are building back up again in each region of Quebec. And within First Nations, there's a First Nations circle on the social economy. And by the way, one of the things I did not mention in my slides, but our relationship with First Nations, that's a whole thing we could talk about for hours, but I think it was I can't remember what year it was, but around 2012, the Assembly of First Nations asked to become part of the governance structure of the Chantier. So that was a very important period. And basically the Grand Chief saying in front of a big audience, this movement is our movement because we share values and we share the same vision of what the economy, economic development. So that was a very important piece of, I guess one could call, reconciliation with the First Nations, and we still have a very good relationship, and the First Nations are still on our board. But we did go through some hard hits, but despite that, the movement was strong enough to survive, and we are in a context now of a repositioned and renewed ecosystem, which is still an emergent, but continues to develop in a very positive sense. So what were the lessons that we learned from this period? Well, first of all, that this movement does, and I think the First Nation speaks to that, is that this was a movement that was built on the basis of recognition of diversity, be it regional diversity, be it sectoral diversity, be it forms of enterprise, be it the recognition of First Nations and their reality and their way of organizing and so on. But it was really it was embracing diversity, which was really a very important lesson for us. And in the same sense that it's not one structure or one way of doing things or one, group of experts, it's an ecosystem that builds a social economy to all that I just said. But that for us to have a real impact on what's going on, we couldn't content ourselves on staying, at a small, on a small level. And so the need to scale up if we really wanted to have the impact that for our communities. But actually, I've been told that it was suggested by Henry Mintzberg that we don't talk about scaling up, but scaling out, which is really truly what we've done, is not necessarily just building bigger and bigger organizations, but making sure that the lessons are learned and that these experiences are being repeated at a small scale. And when you put it all together, it becomes, when you've scaled out or scaled up. We learned lessons around the whole issue of social finance, which is a big debate in Canada today about the delicate balance between supply and demand in social finance, and how important it was to start from the needs and build the finance tools that would help communities, as opposed to getting communities to try and adapt to what the investors were looking for, but that we should start from a bottom-up approach even in the area of finance. And that was quite a revolution in the way people look at the question of finance. The whole issue around institutionalization, that it's not necessarily a negative thing, but you have to navigate with caution, because otherwise you can become, sort of very stiff and not sufficiently in response to what's going on in community. And the issue also of opening up the space for the next generation and new ways of doing things, that I'm talking as an old lady, but next generation, be it, my kids or even my grandkids, they don't, they share the values, they share the objectives, but their ways of doing things, their ways of organizing are different, and we have to be able to adapt and recognize that and allow a lot of space for that. And again, I could go on and on. So just to finish, hey, we're going to make it have 15 minutes of questions. That today the challenges we are facing are multiple as this movement continues to grow and diversify. One of the challenges that is very important for me, and I think for particularly for young people as well, is this whole issue of democracy. Is that the practice of democracy, be it in our relationship with government, within our enterprises, within the movement, and how do we reinforce and strengthen democracy, and not just take it as a key, as if we've got it because we have a nonprofit or because we have a general assembly once a year and so on. That this is a huge challenge in terms of movement building. The challenge, as I said, is scaling out. The challenge of diversity, and within that diversity, the challenge of coherence. What brings us together while we recognize our diversity. And I guess what becomes the biggest, a very big issue now is and I think the urgency of climate change, the urgency of social cohesion, and the gaps between the rich and the poor, that are so huge today. Is that if we want to continue mobilizing and make this movement move forward, and particularly amongst young people, but even for ourselves, is where does this all lead to? Is our goal just building more enterprises, or is it really to change the development model? And if we want to change the development model, how do we articulate that? And how do we articulate that with all kinds of different partners that are working also, for more justice, for fighting poverty, for a clean environment, to save the planet? How can we work together to articulate that development model to become stronger and stronger and maintain, as I say, the local, national, and international mobilization that is necessary and more urgent than ever? So there's 30 years of my life in 45 minutes with even a phone cut. So, but as I say, I think that all the issues that I've raised, we could take each one of them and talk on and on. So what can we do with the last 15 minutes? I'll leave it up to Sarah.
Thanks, Nancy. Thank you so much. It is a quick overview, but it's a rich one. And so there's been a few comments in the chat box, more reflections than questions. If anyone has questions, please type them now, and I'll give us a second to see if one pops up quickly. And if not, I've got a couple on the back of my mind here. In the UK and US, there's growing political support for an alternative economy based on community ownership and social enterprise. Given the Quebec experience, how can we build such political party support here? So I think, hopefully if I've understood that right, I think kind of looking at the question of how do we build that support for an alternative economy in the sort of formal political party organizing that happens. If that's incorrect, Roger, please correct me. But Nancy, do you want to reflect on that? How do we get that kind of support in the formal political environment?
Well, I think that we've already, begun to do that, and as you see in Quebec, one of the key moments was this whole idea of expecting to be part of a common identity, and I think again there's been a lot of progress across Canada on that, but we have to move forward on that. The other thing is I think is that there's some important debates that sometimes we have a tendency, you know, and I think it's to push under the table that need resolution, you know, I know with the labor movement or even with another context. So I would say that, you know, we would probably have, you know, I think, you know, there are some, I won't go into them right now, but there's some really important debates on the table that are going to make a difference on whether we're able to build that movement or not. And I think we have to name them and have those debates and resolve them. And the third thing I would say is that you know, we have to make ourselves more visible in terms of critical mass and work on communication so that people see what we're doing and see how we can bring up, you know, we can come up with some serious proposals. I mean, I know, for example, at one point Hazel Corcoran said, well, GM, you know, could we make it into a worker co-op? Well, maybe that was a bit of too big of a bite to take, but certainly on other issues, there's a lot of things that we could be doing if we were working better together. So, you know, there is an effort right now going on, at least federally, with, you know, there's a, you know, as people know, there's a sort of a broad coalition to be able to take the social innovation, social finance agenda a bit further based on everybody working together a little bit around the model of the Chantier. I think those are all kinds of things that get this onto the political agenda and make sure that all political parties are listening to this, you know, because that's the strength of a movement is that whoever the political party is, they have to recognize you. And that was, for me, why the framework legislation was, when it was voted unanimously, was really important for us. So, I mean, right off, I would have a lot more to say on that, but, you know, this is an ongoing discussion.
Sure. There's a related question, I think, that maybe you partly answered, but do you think a healthy social economy requires a social democratic political environment that's probably the majority in a provincial government? Can it happen without that?
I think it can happen without that. Just because, I mean, again, we have had periods where we have had a more social democrat government that has supported us a lot, but we have, I mean, we have been managed to advance under all governments. You know, sometimes we had some hard hits, but, you know, we've still been able to get ourselves up, and because this is a movement that is you know, is a civil society movement, independent of government. So I think, and often, you know, I would say that even, you know, even at the time, for example, when it was Lucien Bouchard was Premier of Quebec, and he was the one who at the summit and, you know, who picked up on this stuff, and so he was not a, you know, he's not a social democrat, Bouchard. He never was, and, you know, and it still isn't today, but it just made sense. I mean, we had really practical solutions. So I think it's the force of our practical solutions and the fact that we are able to always put proposals as solutions, and any government, you know, if they get a feeling that you're there to help them get the job done, you know, as long as the job is not just to repress people and cut back, but to solve other kinds of problems, I think that we can move forward no matter what. Maybe not federally, but certainly provincially, because of the responsibilities of the provincial government. I must admit, with Harper, it was quite much more difficult.
Yeah, I think we'd all have similar feelings about that national government.
Yeah. And I don't know about Doug Ford, honestly. I don't know. I mean, but you have to have somebody at least who has some kind of logic and way of, you know, having some serious discussion. You know. So,
yeah. I think this is maybe related, but from a practical perspective, I think some of the clout that you developed was because, like you said, you had coherence across so many different sectors. And so there's a question here about, you know, social movements working alongside social economy actors. Can you speak more sort of at a practical level? What does that kind of collaboration look like?
Oh, well, it works at all kinds of levels. It works at, well, I mean, first of all, in terms of our governance, I mean, our governance of the Chantier was made up with, right from the beginning, of networks of enterprises, networks of territories, rural and urban, you know, communities that were working on revitalization and so on, and social movements. They're right there as part of our governance. So, you know, any kind of project was initiated, you would have the women's movement saying, well, what is the role of women? And you have the labor movement making sure that we were concerned about working conditions and so on and so forth. So, so we integrated them right from the beginning into our governance structures. But after that, each problem is, you know, taking on the problem. So, for example, when we said, well, there's a real issue of problem of home care for the elderly, there's a potential, you know, there's to develop, you know, a whole network of social economy enterprises to do that. you know, and there was nervousness in the public sector unions and so on. Well, we sat down and we talked it out, and then we actually had an agreement. Okay, well, our enterprises will go this far, and then the rest we consider that to be part of, you know, a public sector function. Now that has evolved over time. So, you know, the discussion is redone, or, you know, there's you know, so I mean, it's done around very practical, around sectoral things, or for example, around in the case of daycare, we worked with the labor movement and so on, and they actually, you know, because it was important to improve the working conditions of the women working, mainly women working in our daycares. Well, they actually unionized a lot of our enterprises that were nonprofits, and, you know, and nobody complained. On the contrary, and they became allies, and we were able to get better working conditions and renegotiate. So it's very varied, you know. And again, the difference in Quebec is that, you know, going back to the 80s, is that the Quebec labor unions define themselves as early as that as economic actors, set up investment funds and so on, so they've become our major investors as well. So, but with the environmental movement, or with, you know, it would be to specifically look at, you know, for example, the circular economy, and how can we support through our, you know, our type of enterprises, circular economy. So there's all kinds of examples. It can be very practical, but they are part of our governance structure right from the beginning.
Another kind of related question, do you think that the social economy needs to have a fairly homogenous community to start off from? So given that so much of the work is about collaborative social capital, the working together, there's a question here, in places where the population is not homogenous, it's very different, there's high in-migration rates, considerable social and cultural heterogeneity. Is it hard to create a thriving social economy in places like that?
Oh, good question. I mean, I think the issue is you need leader, you know, sort of the natural leadership within communities to buy in for this to work. You know, you can't sort of impose it from outside. So it depends. You know, I mean, we have, you know, done some work, for example. Well, I mean, with the First Nations, that was a whole other, you know, issue of really, you know, dialogue and working together and small projects and individuals and so on. But I think it's sort of the same thing. It's a process. You know, if there are, and you have to go to find out who are the leaders in the community, and what are the networks, and then, you know, work on stuff together. My experience has been that one of the ways of doing that is start with something not very ambitious, you know, very small project, and succeed. If you succeed in that, I mean, that's what we did when we got, you know, the private sector working with the, you know, unions. Nobody had worked together before, but we were able to do one small thing together and said, oh, well, that, you know, that makes sense. And then you moved on to the next and to the next level. So I don't know. I mean, I'm saying that in some cases it may be quite a challenge, but usually there's some forms of natural leaders, and you have to be able to bring them together and around some very concrete things. And I think you build on success like that. That's been my experience, anyhow.
Here's a big question, and one that I think has been part of the CCEDNet conversation probably since its beginning. But if we can't create a social economy as an alternative to our whole structure of market capitalism, do we end up propping up a failing capitalist economy? So kind of, are we filling gaps, or are we propping up deficiencies, or are we actually proposing a real alternative?
Yeah. Well, that's 5 minutes to 4 minutes left. Again, I think that one of the issues, you know, and I used to say that when I was, you know, when I started this stuff, is that even if tomorrow morning, you know, the world leaders sort of turned to me in the community sector and said, okay, you know, we have SCON, take it over. We wouldn't even know what to do with it, you know. We didn't, because we had no idea of what an economy, what economic development and economy and all that. So I think that part of it is part of the work that we do is to really develop our capacity to prove also that there's other ways there's another logic than the dominant economic logic, you know, and that do work. And by doing that, first of all, you are beginning to transform from within. Second of all, you are influencing this. I mean, there's studies that show, I mean, this is such a long discussion, but that show, for example, even a co-op and a consumer market, even if they only have like 5 or 10% of the market, they have an impact on prices, because you're showing that other things can be done differently. Or another example is when we created our patient capital fund, everybody said we were crazy people, but not only did we crazy people, but there were some major financial structures that didn't want us to do it. And they didn't want us to do it because because they were being told that they should do it, and they didn't want us to show that it could be done, because they would say, no, it's not possible to do that, right? So what I was saying is I think that you have to do proof of concept, you have to build, but that's why the scaling out is so important. At one point, we're going to get to a tipping point in certain markets and certain regions and so on, and the public policies will follow. But I think we have to develop our capacity, to do it. And so, I don't think but at the same time, that's why we have to keep our eye on what our long-term mission is. That's the importance of being linked to social movements that are constantly going to remind us that even if we have some really healthy co-ops and enterprising nonprofits, poverty is still out there, and so on and so forth. So we have to keep our link to social movements. And I think we also have to name that that's why we're doing this. For example, the Chantier, at the beginning, our mission was to promote and develop the social economy as a component of the Quebec economy, and then we changed it. We said you have to promote and develop the social economy as a component of a new development model. And that's where the challenge, want to talk about coming challenges. I think we're at a point where there's enough stuff going on internationally and nationally to be able to start articulating what that economic development model is, based on knowledge, on practice, on best practices, on learning to have work together. And not only is it time to do it, but it's really urgent because of the environmental crisis that has really put, time is running out. So now we have to really accelerate the pace. But if we hadn't done all the other work before, I don't think we would be able to take that challenge on. But now we have to do it, and we have to do it big time.
Yeah. Well, I think those are great words to end on. That I'm with you. I think we do have an alternative, and the more time we spend really articulating that to people, the more folks are excited about it. When we talk just about the enterprise itself, it doesn't usually capture a whole new audience. So when we talk about that big alternative, I think we see eyes turning our way. Yeah. So I want to thank
particularly young
so
people, and it's a huge mobilizing thing for young people. Absolutely. Yes.
I agree. So I want to say thanks so much to Nancy. This is a wonderful presentation. It was very quick and very rich. It's a taster of that history. Hopefully it's invigorated some of you. It's inspired you, informed you. Maybe you've got more questions, and now you know Nancy and know her face. You could probably reach out. Also tomorrow, if yourself or colleagues would like to see this actually in French, Nancy's going to repeat this webinar en français for anyone who might be interested. So share that news around. And of course, if you want to stay in touch and engage on these kinds of topics and ones related to this conversation, check out our website, sign up to our free email newsletters, and you're going to get an email with a 1-minute evaluation survey. Please do fill that out. It helps us a lot. And as Matthew mentioned, the webinar will be available online, and you'll get a link to it along with materials like the PowerPoint from today. So thanks, everyone. I see some great things happening in the chat box. We appreciate your time and being with us. And, let's keep enjoying this 20 years together and keep organizing for another 20. And we're going to tackle that giant crisis together. So thanks, everybody.
Bye.